The sun was already blazing hot at 6 in the morning at Forward Operating Base Thunder. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and rocks that seemed to swallow everything. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked toward the Apache helicopter landing pad. Her boots crunched on the gravel path that connected the living quarters to the flight line. Sarah had been doing this same job for 3 years now. Load ammunition into the Apache attack helicopters, check the weapon systems, make sure everything was perfect before the pilots took off on their dangerous missions. It was important work. If she made even one small mistake, good soldiers could die. She was 24 years old and had joined the Army when she was 19. Her fellow soldiers respected her because she worked hard and never complained. Even when the temperature reached 120 degrees in the shade, Sarah kept working. Even when rocket attacks forced everyone to run for cover in the middle of loading ammunition, she always came back to finish the job. Today felt different, though. Sarah could sense something unusual in the air. More officers than normal were walking around the base. Radio chatter seemed more intense. Soldiers were speaking in hushed voices about a special mission that was supposed to happen later that morning. Sarah did not ask questions about these things. In the military, you did your job and minded your own business. The Apache helicopter she was assigned to work on today was tail number 847. It was a massive machine that looked like a metal predator ready to hunt. The helicopter had 2 seats, one for the pilot and one for the gunner. Between them, they controlled enough firepower to destroy an entire enemy compound. Sarah opened her equipment box and pulled out the first belt of 30mm ammunition. Each round was as long as her hand and could punch through armor like paper. She had loaded thousands of these rounds over the years. Her movements were smooth and practiced. Lift the ammunition belt. Check each round for defects. Load it into the chain gun system. Secure the connections. Move to the next belt. Other members of her ground crew were working on different parts of the helicopter. Sergeant Williams was checking the fuel systems. Corporal Jackson was inspecting the rotor blades for damage. Private Morrison was testing the communication equipment. They all worked together like parts of a well-oiled machine. The heat was already becoming unbearable. Sarah rolled up the sleeves of her desert camouflage uniform to stay cooler. The fabric was thick and designed to protect soldiers from the sun, but it also trapped heat against the skin. Rolling up her sleeves helped air flow over her arms and made the work more bearable. Sarah had always been strong. Even as a teenager, she could lift heavy objects that other girls her age could not handle. Her arms showed the results of years of physical training and hard work. Muscles moved under her tan skin as she lifted each ammunition belt into position. The ammunition loading process required complete focus. One mistake could cause a jam during combat. A jammed weapon in a firefight meant dead soldiers. Sarah had seen the results of equipment failures before, helicopters coming back with bullet holes, crew members wounded because their weapons did not work when they needed them most. She never wanted to be responsible for something like that. As Sarah worked, she thought about the letter she had received from home last week. Her aunt had written to tell her about family news. Her cousin had gotten married. Her uncle had started a new job. Normal life seemed so far away from this desert war zone. Sometimes Sarah wondered what her life would have been like if she had made different choices. The work continued steadily. Sarah loaded belt after belt of ammunition into the helicopter. Each belt contained 250 rounds. The helicopter could carry up to 1,200 rounds total. That was enough ammunition to fight for 30 minutes of continuous combat. In helicopter warfare, 30 minutes could determine who lived and who died. Captain Jake Sullivan was scheduled to pilot this Apache on today's mission. Sarah had seen him around the base many times but had never spoken to him directly. He was a respected pilot with over 200 combat missions. Other soldiers said he was fearless in battle but also careful with his crew's lives. He never took unnecessary risks that could get people killed. Sarah heard boots approaching on the gravel behind her. She looked up to see Captain Sullivan walking toward the helicopter for his pre-flight inspection. He was tall and lean, with short brown hair and serious eyes. His flight suit was already dark with sweat stains even though the mission had not started yet. Sullivan always inspected his aircraft personally before every mission. He checked the weapons, the fuel, the engines, and all the systems that kept the helicopter flying. Good pilots never trusted their lives to other people's work, no matter how skilled those people were. They verified everything themselves. Sarah continued loading ammunition as the pilot began his inspection routine. She was focused on her work and did not pay much attention to Sullivan as he moved around the helicopter. The ammunition belts were heavy and required her full attention to handle safely. The desert wind picked up slightly, providing a brief moment of relief from the heat. Sand swirled around the helicopter pad, and Sarah had to squint to keep particles out of her eyes. The wind also helped cool the sweat on her exposed arms where she had rolled up her sleeves. Sullivan worked his way around the helicopter, checking each system methodically. He tested the landing gear, examined the rotor blades, and verified that all the external equipment was secure. His movements were professional and efficient. He had done this same inspection routine hundreds of times before. As Sullivan approached the weapons bay where Sarah was working, he glanced in her direction to see how the ammunition loading was progressing. The timing of the weapons loading was critical for mission planning. If the ammunition was not ready on time, the entire mission schedule could be delayed. That was when Sullivan saw something that made him stop walking. His eyes focused on Sarah's left forearm, where her rolled-up sleeve had exposed several inches of skin. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat and his heart start beating faster. On Sarah's forearm was a tattoo. But this was not an ordinary tattoo that soldiers often got during their time in the military. This tattoo contained symbols and designs that Sullivan recognized from classified intelligence briefings. Symbols that were associated with enemy forces. Symbols that should not exist on the arm of an American soldier. Captain Sullivan stood frozen beside the Apache helicopter. His mind struggled to process what his eyes had just seen. The tattoo on Sarah Martinez's forearm was not something he could ignore or forget. Those symbols were burned into his memory from dozens of classified intelligence briefings over the past 2 years. The briefings had been clear and urgent. Enemy forces were using sophisticated infiltration tactics to place operatives inside American military bases. These operatives could gather intelligence, sabotage equipment, or even turn weapons against coalition forces during critical moments. The tattoo symbols Sullivan had just seen were identification marks used by one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the region. Sullivan's training as a military pilot had taught him to make quick decisions under pressure, but this situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. If Sarah was truly an enemy operative, she had access to some of the most deadly weapon systems on the base. She could sabotage the ammunition she was loading. She could gather intelligence about mission plans. She could even turn the weapons against American forces at the worst possible moment. But what if he was wrong? What if the tattoo had an innocent explanation? Sarah had been working on this base for 3 years. She had loaded ammunition for hundreds of missions. Other soldiers trusted her. She had never given anyone reason to suspect her loyalty. Destroying an innocent soldier's career based on a tattoo would be a terrible mistake. Sullivan forced himself to continue his pre-flight inspection while his mind raced through possibilities. He checked the fuel gauges and tested the engine controls, but his attention kept returning to Sarah. Now that he was looking more carefully, he began to notice other details that had escaped his attention before. Sarah's movements as she loaded ammunition were practiced and efficient. But there was something different about her technique. Most soldiers learned weapons handling through standardized military training programs. Their movements followed predictable patterns that were taught in boot camp and advanced schools. Sarah's technique was similar but not identical. There were small variations that suggested she might have learned from different instructors using different methods. Sullivan watched as Sarah lifted another ammunition belt into the chain gun system. Her hand positions were slightly different from what American military manuals recommended. Her body mechanics showed influences from training programs that Sullivan did not recognize. These differences were subtle. Most people would never notice them. But Sullivan had worked with weapons specialists from many different countries during joint training exercises. He had learned to recognize the small variations that indicated different training backgrounds. The pilot continued his inspection routine while observing Sarah more closely. She worked with complete focus and professionalism. Her uniform was properly maintained. Her equipment was organized and clean. She followed all safety protocols exactly as required. But Sullivan noticed that her eyes were constantly moving. She was aware of everything happening around her in ways that went beyond normal military alertness. Most soldiers focused primarily on their immediate work area during routine tasks. They paid attention to their surroundings, but did not maintain the constant situational awareness that Sarah was displaying. Her level of alertness was more consistent with someone who had received specialized training in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. Sullivan tested the helicopter's communication systems while continuing to watch Sarah work. She was speaking occasionally with other members of the ground crew, but her conversations were brief and focused on work-related topics. She did not engage in the casual joking and personal stories that usually filled quiet moments during routine operations. The other ground crew members seemed to respect Sarah's professional attitude. They did not appear suspicious of her behavior. Sergeant Williams had worked with Sarah for over a year and clearly trusted her competence with weapon systems. Corporal Jackson often asked for Sarah's advice when dealing with difficult ammunition loading procedures. Private Morrison had mentioned several times that Sarah was one of the most reliable specialists on the base, but Sullivan was now seeing things from a different perspective. Sarah's professional distance from her colleagues could indicate that she was maintaining an operational cover identity. Her technical expertise with weapon systems could have been developed through enemy training programs. Her constant situational awareness could be the result of intelligence operative training rather than normal military alertness. The desert heat continued to build as the morning progressed. Other helicopters on the flight line were also being prepared for missions. Ground crews worked steadily to complete their tasks before the temperature became unbearable. Radio communications between different work areas created a constant background of military chatter and coordination. Sullivan completed his inspection of the helicopter's defensive systems while his mind wrestled with the decision he would have to make. The mission was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. If Sarah was indeed an enemy operative, delaying the mission to investigate could put other operations at risk. But launching the mission with potentially compromised equipment could be even more dangerous. The pilot looked at his watch and realized he was running out of time to make a decision. Sarah was nearly finished loading the ammunition. Once the weapon systems were fully loaded and the helicopter was cleared for flight, it would be too late to investigate his suspicions without causing major disruptions to the mission schedule. Sullivan thought about the other soldiers who would be depending on his helicopter for air support during today's operation. Ground troops were counting on his firepower to protect them during a dangerous reconnaissance mission in enemy territory. If he grounded the helicopter based on suspicions that turned out to be wrong, good soldiers could die because they lacked the air support they needed. But if Sarah had sabotaged the ammunition or weapon systems, Sullivan and his gunner could be killed when they tried to engage enemy targets. Worse yet, a sabotaged helicopter could crash in friendly territory and cause casualties among the soldiers they were supposed to protect. The weight of command responsibility pressed down on Sullivan's shoulders. Every decision a military officer made could have life or death consequences. But this decision felt more critical than most because it involved questions of trust, loyalty, and the possibility that everything he thought he knew about Sarah Martinez might be a carefully constructed lie. Sullivan made his choice. He could not ignore what he had seen. The lives of too many soldiers depended on the reliability of the weapon systems that Sarah had been working on. He had to confront her directly and get answers to his questions before the mission could proceed safely. Captain Sullivan finished his inspection of the helicopter's tail section and walked slowly back toward where Sarah was working. His heart was beating faster than normal, but he kept his expression calm and professional. Years of military training had taught him to control his emotions during dangerous situations. This was definitely a dangerous situation. Sarah was securing the last ammunition belt into the chain gun system. Her movements were precise and confident. She had no idea that her carefully hidden secret had been discovered. The rolled-up sleeves that had given her relief from the desert heat had also exposed the tattoo that could destroy everything she had worked for. During the past 3 years, Sullivan stopped about 6 feet away from Sarah and cleared his throat. She looked up from her work with the same professional expression she always wore during equipment loading operations. Her dark eyes met his without any sign of concern or worry. If she was truly an enemy operative, she was extremely good at maintaining her cover identity. Sergeant Martinez, Sullivan said, using her military rank and last name to keep the conversation formal. His voice was steady and calm, giving no indication of the suspicions that were racing through his mind. "I need to speak with you about something important." Sarah set down the ammunition belt she was holding and turned to face him completely. "Yes, sir," she replied. "What can I help you with, Captain?" Her voice carried the respectful tone that enlisted soldiers used when speaking with officers. But Sullivan thought he detected something else in her voice now. A slight accent that he had never noticed before. How was that possible? Sullivan had heard Sarah speak many times during the 3 years she had been working on the base. He had always assumed she was from somewhere in the American Southwest, maybe Texas or New Mexico. Many soldiers from those areas had slight accents that reflected their regional backgrounds. But now that he was listening more carefully, Sarah's accent seemed different. It had subtle qualities that reminded him of people from Middle Eastern countries. "I need to ask you about something personal," Sullivan continued. He gestured toward Sarah's left forearm where the tattoo was still partially visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. "That artwork on your arm caught my attention. It looks like it might have special meaning." Sarah's expression changed almost immediately. The change was so small that most people would not have noticed it. But Sullivan was watching her face very carefully. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The muscles around her mouth tightened just a little bit. Her shoulders shifted in a way that suggested she was preparing for some kind of action. These were not the reactions of an innocent soldier who had been asked about a harmless tattoo. These were the reactions of someone who realized that their secret had been discovered and was calculating their next move. "It is just a design I got when I was younger," Sarah said. Her voice was still respectful, but Sullivan could hear the tension underneath her words. "Nothing special about it, sir." Sullivan took one small step closer to Sarah. He wanted to see her reaction to increased pressure. His right hand moved slightly closer to the pistol on his belt. The movement was subtle and could look like a natural adjustment of his equipment, but it put his hand in position to draw his weapon quickly if necessary. "The design looks familiar to me," Sullivan said. He kept his voice conversational, but his words carried a clear message. He recognized the tattoo for what it was. "I have seen similar symbols before." In intelligence briefings, Sarah's body language changed again. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, a stance that would allow her to move quickly in any direction. Her hands moved away from the ammunition she had been handling and hung loose at her sides. Sullivan recognized these preparations for potential combat action. The other members of the ground crew continued working on different parts of the helicopter. Sergeant Williams was still checking fuel systems on the other side of the aircraft. Corporal Jackson was inspecting rotor blade connections near the front of the helicopter. Private Morrison was testing communication equipment in the cockpit. None of them were close enough to hear the conversation between Sullivan and Sarah. "Intelligence briefings can cover many different topics," Sarah said carefully. Her accent was becoming more noticeable as stress affected her ability to maintain her American speech patterns. Sometimes symbols can look similar even when they mean very different things. Sullivan knew he had reached a critical moment in the confrontation. Sarah was clearly aware that he suspected her true identity. She was prepared for the conversation to turn violent, but she was also still trying to maintain her cover story and avoid admitting anything that could be used against her. "You are right that symbols can be confusing," Sullivan replied, "but some symbols are very specific. They are used by particular groups for particular purposes, groups that are enemies of the United States." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Both soldiers understood that they had moved beyond casual conversation into something much more serious. Sarah's true identity was no longer hidden. Sullivan's suspicions were no longer secret. Everything that happened next would determine whether this confrontation ended with arrests and investigations, or with violence and death. Sarah looked directly into Sullivan's eyes. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The desert wind blew sand across the helicopter pad. Radio chatter from other parts of the base continued in the background. The routine activities of military life went on around them, while two people faced each other across a gap that could not be bridged with words. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Captain?" Sarah asked. Her voice was quiet but steady. The accent was now clearly audible. She had stopped trying to hide her true origins. Sullivan realized that Sarah was giving him one last chance to back down from the confrontation. If he continued pressing his accusations, there would be no way to return to the normal working relationship they had maintained for the past 3 years. Everything would change permanently. But Sullivan also knew that too many lives were at stake for him to ignore what he had discovered. American soldiers were depending on the weapons that Sarah had been handling. If those weapons had been sabotaged, good people would die because he failed to act on his suspicions. I am not accusing you of anything yet, Sullivan said, but I am asking you to explain why you have a tattoo that contains symbols used by terrorist organizations that are actively fighting against coalition forces. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly as she realized that her cover identity was completely blown. The careful construction of 3 years was falling apart in a matter of minutes. She had to make a choice about how to respond to Sullivan's direct challenge. Sarah looked at Captain Sullivan for a long moment. The desert wind continued to blow sand around them, but everything else seemed to have stopped. The sounds of the busy military base faded into the background as both soldiers realized they had reached a point where lies and deception were no longer possible. You want to know the truth about this tattoo? Sarah said quietly. Her voice had completely lost the American accent she had worked so hard to perfect over the years. The words came out with the clear pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language. Then I will tell you the truth. Sullivan kept his hand near his weapon but did not draw it. Something in Sarah's voice made him want to hear what she had to say before taking any action. Her tone was not threatening or hostile. Instead, she sounded tired and sad, like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Sarah slowly pushed up her left sleeve to reveal the complete tattoo on her forearm. The design was more complex than Sullivan had realized. Intricate patterns and symbols covered her skin from her wrist to her elbow. Some of the symbols were clearly the enemy identification marks that Sullivan recognized from intelligence briefings, but other parts of the tattoo were different, newer looking, and seemed to tell a different story. I was 15 years old when they first approached me, Sarah began. Her eyes were focused on something far beyond the helicopter and the military base, as if she was seeing events from her past. My family lived in a small village outside Kandahar. My father was a teacher. My mother sold vegetables in the local market. I had 2 younger brothers who were still in elementary school. Sullivan listened without interrupting. He knew that Sarah was about to tell him something that could change everything about this situation. Her voice carried the weight of painful memories that she had probably never shared with anyone else. One day, American helicopters came to our village. Sarah continued. The pilots thought they were attacking enemy fighters who had been using buildings in our area to store weapons. But there were no enemy fighters there, just families trying to live normal lives in the middle of a war that we never asked for. Sarah's voice became quieter as she described what had happened next. The missile hit our house directly. My parents and brothers were killed instantly. I was at school when it happened. When I came home, there was nothing left but rubble and smoke and the smell of death. Sullivan felt his stomach tighten as he listened to Sarah's story. He had flown many combat missions over the years. He knew that sometimes innocent people were killed by mistake during military operations. It was one of the terrible realities of warfare that every soldier had to live with. The people who recruited me found me 3 days later, Sarah said. I was living in the ruins of my house because I had nowhere else to go. They told me that Americans had murdered my family. They said that joining their organization was the only way to get justice for what had been done to me. She touched the older parts of her tattoo with her right hand. These symbols represent my oath of loyalty to their cause. They represent my promise to seek revenge against the people who destroyed my family. I was young and angry, and I wanted someone to pay for all the pain I was feeling. Sullivan began to understand the complexity of the situation he was facing. Sarah was not just an enemy operative who had been trained to infiltrate American military bases. She was someone who had joined the enemy because American military actions had destroyed everything she cared about. Her motivation came from personal loss and grief, not from abstract political beliefs. They spent 2 years training me, Sarah continued. I learned to speak English without an accent. I learned American military procedures and customs. I learned how to create a false identity that would pass background investigations. They taught me everything I needed to know to become Sarah Martinez instead of my real name. Sullivan wanted to ask what her real name was, but he decided to let her continue telling her story without interruption. She seemed to need to get these words out after years of keeping them secret. The plan was for me to enlist in the American Army and get assigned to a position where I could access weapon systems, Sarah said. After I gained the trust of my fellow soldiers, I would be given specific missions to sabotage equipment or gather intelligence that could be used against coalition forces. She looked directly at Sullivan as she spoke the next words. I was supposed to modify some of the ammunition I loaded into your helicopter today. The modifications would cause a catastrophic explosion during combat that would kill you and your gunner. Your deaths would be reported as casualties from enemy fire, not as the result of sabotage. Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. Sarah had just admitted that she had been planning to murder him and his flight crew, but she had also revealed her plan instead of carrying it out. He tried to understand why she would confess to attempted murder, instead of simply completing her mission. Sarah seemed to read the confusion in Sullivan's expression. "You want to know why I'm telling you this instead of following my orders," she said. "The answer is complicated, but I will try to explain it." She pointed to the newer parts of her tattoo, the sections that looked different from the original enemy symbols. 6 months ago, I had these new designs added to cover some of the old ones. The new symbols represent something that my original handlers would consider the worst kind of betrayal. Sullivan looked more closely at the modified sections of the tattoo. The new ink was clearly more recent than the rest of the design. Someone had deliberately changed parts of the original tattoo to create new meanings and messages. "The new symbols represent a choice I made," Sarah said. "A choice to stop living for revenge and start living for something better. A choice to protect the people who had shown me kindness instead of destroying them. A choice to become the person I wanted to be instead of the weapon that others had trained me to be." Sullivan realized that he was witnessing something remarkable. Sarah was not just confessing to being an enemy operative. She was explaining how and why she had decided to abandon her mission and change sides in the middle of a war. Captain Sullivan stared at Sarah as her words sank into his mind. She had just confessed to being an enemy operative who was supposed to kill him today. But instead of carrying out her mission, she was standing here telling him the truth. The situation was unlike anything he had encountered in all his years of military service. "What changed your mind?" Sullivan asked. His voice was steady, but inside he felt a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else he could not identify. "Why are you telling me this instead of completing your mission?" Sarah looked at the helicopter they had both been working on. The ammunition she had loaded was still there, ready for the combat mission that was supposed to begin in less than 10 minutes. But now everything was different. The mission could not proceed until this situation was resolved. 3 years is a long time to live among people you are supposed to hate, Sarah said. "When I first arrived at this base, I thought all American soldiers were monsters who killed innocent families for no reason. I expected to find cruel people who enjoyed causing pain and destruction." She paused and looked around at the other ground crew members who were still working on nearby helicopters. Sergeant Williams was finishing his fuel system checks. Corporal Jackson was securing rotor blade connections. Private Morrison was testing radio equipment. None of them knew that their trusted colleague had just revealed herself to be an enemy operative. "But that is not what I found here," Sarah continued. "Instead, I met people who cared about each other. People who risked their lives to protect civilians during combat operations. People who sent money home to support their families and worried about loved ones just like everyone else in the world." Sullivan listened carefully to every word. He was trying to understand how someone could spend 3 years planning to commit murder and then suddenly change their mind. The psychology of espionage and betrayal was complex, but Sarah seemed to be describing something even more complicated than that. "Sergeant Williams brought me soup when I got food poisoning last year," Sarah said. "He sat with me in the medical tent and told me stories about his daughter back home in Ohio. He showed me pictures of her birthday party and talked about how much he missed reading bedtime stories to her." Sarah's voice became softer as she shared these memories. "Corporal Jackson helped me study for my promotion exam. He spent hours explaining military regulations and procedures, even though he had his own work to finish. When I passed the exam, he was more excited about my success than I was." Sullivan began to understand what had happened to Sarah during her 3 years on the base. She had been sent to infiltrate and destroy, but instead she had experienced friendship and kindness from the people she was supposed to kill. These personal connections had gradually changed her perspective on the war and her role in it. "Private Morrison listened when I had nightmares about my family," Sarah continued. "I told him the nightmares were about combat stress, but he never asked too many questions. He just sat with me during the bad nights and reminded me that everyone here understood what it felt like to lose people you loved." Sullivan realized that Sarah had been living a double life that was more difficult than he had imagined. She had been forced to accept kindness and friendship from people she was supposed to betray. Over time, those relationships had become more real to her than her original mission of revenge. 6 months ago, I received new orders from my handlers," Sarah said. "They wanted me to sabotage 3 helicopters during a major operation that would result in the deaths of 12 American aircrew members. When I thought about following those orders, I realized I could not do it. She touched the modified sections of her tattoo again. That night, I went to a tattoo artist in the nearest town and had him change parts of the original design. The new symbols represent my choice to protect the people who had become my friends instead of destroying them. Sullivan looked at his watch and realized that the scheduled mission launch time had already passed. Other pilots and ground crews were probably wondering why his helicopter had not reported ready for departure. Soon someone would come to investigate the delay. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Sullivan asked. "You have just confessed to being an enemy agent. You have admitted that you were planning to commit murder. Even if you changed your mind, I cannot ignore what you have told me." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know that my life as Sarah Martinez is over," she said. "I cannot continue living this lie, and I cannot return to my original handlers because they would kill me for betraying the mission. I am telling you the truth because it is the right thing to do, even if it means spending the rest of my life in prison." Sullivan faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Sarah had confessed to serious crimes, but she had also prevented those crimes from being completed. She had information about enemy infiltration tactics that could save many American lives, but she had also spent 3 years deceiving everyone around her. "There might be another option," Sullivan said slowly. "The intelligence value of what you know could be more important than punishment for what you plan to do. If you are willing to cooperate completely with American intelligence services, there might be a way for you to make up for the harm you intended to cause." Sarah looked surprised by Sullivan's suggestion. She had expected to be arrested immediately and charged with treason and attempted murder. The possibility of cooperation instead of imprisonment had not occurred to her. "What would cooperation involve?" she asked. "You would help intelligence officers understand how enemy infiltration networks operate," Sullivan explained. "You would identify other operatives who might be working on American bases. You would provide information that could prevent future attacks and save American lives." Sullivan pulled out his radio and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Instead of calling military police to arrest Sarah, he contacted the base intelligence officer with a different message. "This is Captain Sullivan," he said into the radio. "I need to speak with Colonel Martinez in intelligence immediately. We have a situation that requires discreet handling. We may have just discovered our most valuable intelligence asset in the fight against enemy infiltration." As Sarah listened to Sullivan's radio call, she realized that her confession had not ended her life but transformed it. Instead of being punished as an enemy agent, she would have the opportunity to become a genuine protector of the people who had shown her friendship and kindness. The beam desert sun continued to beat down on forward operating Base Thunder as 2 soldiers stood beside an Apache helicopter and changed the course of a war through an act of trust and redemption. 6 months had passed since the morning when Captain Sullivan discovered Sarah's secret beside the Apache helicopter. The desert base looked the same, but everything had changed for both of them. Sarah no longer worked as an ammunition specialist. Instead, she spent her days in a secure building at the center of the base, working with intelligence officers to unravel enemy infiltration networks. Colonel Martinez, the base intelligence officer, had been skeptical when Sullivan first contacted him about Sarah's situation. The idea that an enemy operative would voluntarily confess and offer to switch sides seemed too good to be true. But as Sarah provided detailed information about training methods, communication systems, and other infiltration operatives, her value became impossible to ignore. Sarah had helped identify 12 other enemy agents working on coalition bases across Afghanistan. 3 of them were arrested before they could complete sabotage missions that would have killed dozens of soldiers. The intelligence she provided led to the dismantling of 2 major recruitment and training facilities used by terrorist organizations to prepare infiltration operatives. But the transition from enemy agent to intelligence asset had not been easy for Sarah. She lived under constant guard in a small room that was part protection and part imprisonment. She could not contact anyone from her previous life. She could not leave the base without armed escorts. She could not be certain that American intelligence officers truly trusted her or simply viewed her as a useful tool. The psychological pressure of her situation sometimes felt overwhelming. Sarah had spent 3 years building relationships with soldiers who thought they knew who she was. Now those same people had been told that she was an enemy operative, who had been planning to kill their friends. Some soldiers refused to speak to her. Others looked at her with suspicion and anger whenever they saw her around the base. Sergeant Williams had been particularly hurt by the revelation of Sarah's true identity. He felt betrayed by someone he had considered a close friend. When he learned that Sarah had been planning to sabotage helicopters that could have killed pilots he worked with every day, he requested a transfer to a different base. Before leaving, he told Sarah that he could not forgive her for lying to him for 3 years. Corporal Jackson had reacted differently to the news about Sarah. He was angry about the deception, but he also remembered how Sarah had helped him during difficult times. When intelligence officers asked him to verify details about Sarah's behavior and relationships on the base, Jackson provided honest answers that supported her claims about changing sides. Private Morrison visited Sarah several times in the intelligence facility. He told her that he understood why she had originally wanted revenge against American forces after losing her family. He also said that he respected her decision to abandon her mission when she realized that individual soldiers were not responsible for the policies that had caused her pain. Captain Sullivan found himself in an unusual position as the person who had discovered Sarah's secret and convinced intelligence officers to work with her instead of simply imprisoning her. Some officers praised his judgment and credited him with uncovering a valuable intelligence asset. Others questioned whether he had been foolish to trust someone who had been planning to kill him. Sullivan continued flying combat missions, but he often thought about the morning when everything changed. He wondered what would have happened if he had not noticed Sarah's tattoo. Would she have gone through with her mission to sabotage his helicopter? Would he and his gunner have died in a mysterious equipment failure that no one would have traced back to enemy infiltration? The intelligence work that Sarah was doing had personal meaning for Sullivan. Every piece of information she provided could prevent other soldiers from facing the same danger he had unknowingly been in. Every enemy operative who was identified and arrested because of Sarah's cooperation meant fewer American lives at risk from sabotage and infiltration. But Sullivan also understood the complexity of Sarah's situation. She had made a choice to abandon her mission and help the people she had originally planned to hurt. That choice had saved his life and the lives of many other soldiers. But it had also left her isolated from both sides of the conflict. Trusted by neither her original handlers nor many of the American soldiers she was now helping. One afternoon, Sullivan received permission to visit Sarah in the intelligence facility. He found her sitting at a desk covered with photographs and documents related to enemy infiltration operations. She looked tired and older than her 25 years. The stress of her double life and current situation had taken a visible toll on her appearance and health. "How are you holding up?" Sullivan asked as he sat down across from her. Sarah looked up from the documents she had been reviewing. "Some days are better than others," she said. Her English still carried a slight accent, but she no longer tried to hide her true origins. "I know that what I am doing now is important, but sometimes I wonder if I will ever have a normal life again." Sullivan nodded with understanding. Military life was difficult enough for soldiers who served openly and honestly. Sarah's situation was far more complicated because of her past and the ongoing security concerns about her loyalty. "The intelligence officers tell me that my information has helped save many lives," Sarah continued. "That knowledge helps me feel that I am finally doing something good with my life instead of planning to destroy it. But I also know that many people here will never trust me completely, no matter how much I help." Sullivan thought about Sarah's comment for a moment before responding. "Trust is something that has to be earned over time," he said. "You made mistakes in the past, but you also made the right choice when it mattered most. People will judge you based on your actions going forward, not just on what you planned to do before." Sarah managed a small smile at Sullivan's words. "I hope you are right," she said. "I want to believe that people can change, and that past mistakes do not have to define someone's entire future." Sullivan looked at the intelligence documents spread across Sarah's desk and realized that she was already proving that people could change. Every day she provided information that protected soldiers who had once been her targets. Every enemy operative who was captured because of her cooperation was evidence that her transformation from enemy agent to American asset was real and valuable. "What happens when this war ends?" Sarah asked. "Will I be able to live somewhere normal, Or will I always be in protective custody because of what I know about enemy operations? Sullivan did not have a good answer to Sarah's question. Her future would depend on many factors beyond his control or knowledge, but he could see that she was thinking about life beyond the current conflict, which suggested that she had hope for eventual freedom and normalcy. As Sullivan prepared to leave the intelligence facility, Sarah thanked him for giving her the opportunity to prove that she had truly changed sides. She told him that his decision to contact intelligence instead of military police had saved her life and given her the chance to do something meaningful with the years she had left. Walking back across the base toward his helicopter, Sullivan reflected on how one moment of observation and one difficult decision had changed the course of 2 lives and potentially saved many others. The war would continue, but at least some small part of it had been transformed by the power of human choice and the possibility of redemption.